Hello and welcome to another edition of Film Seizure Streams the Movies. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this time around I've got another documentary from Monster Man Seth Breedlove's Small Town Monsters production company. In this documentary, Breedlove is on the hunt for the Rougarou, which is also known as the Cajun werewolf. Now, this film, Skinwalker, the Howl of the Rougarou, hits the Small Town Monsters website on Tuesday, September 14th. I got the opportunity to take a look at the film early, but this is not a paid-for review or anything like that. I just like taking a look at these cryptozoology flicks, and I'm always glad when I can get an invite to watch the latest from Breedlove and team. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about Cajun werewolves, shall we? What is the Rougarou, and where did the legend come from? Well, it should be no surprise that pretty much every region on the planet has some form of the werewolf legend. In the southern swamps of the United States, that's the Rougarou, or the Skinwalker. Now, interestingly, the term Skinwalker is often applied to several similar ideas across several tribes in the United States. At least that's what the 1995 direct-to-video movie Werewolf has me believe. But whether or not it is the same Skinwalker as we learn about here doesn't really matter. What's most interesting is that this is a very common legend across all of the world. Pretty much everywhere you go, in every at least similar region in the world, doesn't matter if it's the southern United States, someplace in Canada where you have something like the Wendigo, or in certain regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, but there's also some in the western side of Europe. Pretty much everywhere you go, you'll hear tales of two things: vampires and shapeshifters like werewolves. Sometimes vampires are shapeshifters who turn into werewolves. So, werewolves are a pretty interesting concept. While not every shape-shifting creature turns into a wolf-like monster, wolves are very common, and they associate very commonly with that myth. Wolves are our ancestors' companions. They became the dogs that we cherish today. So, I think it is quite common to look at a dog as something almost human, but also see and share some sort of animalistic similarities as well. It's an interesting idea from an anthropological basis that humans aren't too far removed from our more base animalistic tendencies. I think it terrifies us because we believe ourselves to be above that kind of concept, I think. Now, it's why I think these kind of cannibalistic legends are born. It's the terror we feel when we think we are too much like the animals beneath us on the ecological hierarchy. Now, this legend, we learn in the early moments of the movie, were born from the southern native tribes. One tribe was very warlike and would unleash the Skinwalker to eat their enemies. Two other tribes formed an alliance to fight back the warlike tribe. As they were on the run from the now much more powerful teamed up group, they became something else. With the help of their shamans and the spirit world, they became the Rougarou. Now, this was a legend that predates Europeans coming over to the Americas. But as the centuries passed, stories of a howling beast being heard in the swamps of Louisiana, accompanied by the sight of two red eyes staring back at people, started popping up. Now, one of the hallmarks of the films from Breedlove kicks in the first 10 minutes or so. We get that history of Louisiana. The things that we picture as outsiders — I'm from Indiana, I'm from the North — we think of, the state, and to a certain degree, what we extrapolate out to the rest of the South as a whole. But Louisiana is a curious confluence of several ideas. It's farmland to the north, endless marshes to the south, and a mix of two very different types of people. We're told basically how the Cajun people settled the area after being, after first or some of them coming from France itself, while some of them are being kicked out by the British who go to Nova Scotia. So they were French Canadians, came down to Louisiana. Later on, we hear about how Irish people came over and settled in Louisiana during the Irish famine that took place in the mid 1800s. So, so it's, of course, there are going to be a lot of native peoples too, specifically from what some of the people recognize as the Homa tribe. Now, the Homas are not truly recognized as a tribe to the rest of the Indian nations of North America. And they have a difficult time integrating, or at least did for a long time. They weren't invited to go elsewhere with other tribes. They were basically forced to integrate into the white people's, the white man's world, and it was difficult for them. However, Homa is a town in southwest Louisiana that is, or at least in South Louisiana, that is a hot spot. So it gets a lot of people from the surrounding areas coming in for various reasons. So it's an interesting combination of these different backgrounds. Now, when it comes to the stories about the Rougarou, this movie posits lots of concepts about the origins. Naturally, there are lots of eyewitness and local experts around that are interviewed. One of the things that I will always appreciate about these documentaries are that Breedlove and crew always interviews people to let them tell their stories. They don't come off as crazy. They saw something that their brains can't reconcile with common everyday sights, among other things, which I'll get to here in a moment. They don't say, I definitely saw a werewolf, or there cannot be anything that I saw other than a Rougarou, at least for most of the people who are telling their stories. No, they're just telling their stories, and they will admit that they don't really know what they saw. There is some open interpretation that can be brought into this, but they know that it scared them and it stuck with them forever. And I should say that there are firsthand examples of stories that are reported as true, but I'll come back to this concept here in a few minutes. But that's the sort of thing that separates small town monster productions from the typical 30 to 60 minute cable network monster shows, hunting ghosts or Bigfoot or aliens. There will always be someone who will believe that they have compelling evidence in these movies. But it comes from something that goes beyond wondering if they saw what they think they saw, or if it was a trick of the light, etc. There's always some sort of room for interpretation. But regardless, it refuses to force a conclusion onto the viewers. Watch the movie, hear the stories, learn more about the legends and the area that these legends were born out of. Sometimes you see things in the sociology or the background of how this area came to be that tells you everything that you need to know on whether or not these stories are really true or if they're just passed down legends. It's a really it really helps you sometimes understand why these things are reported as they are. Now, the term Rougarou itself is seemingly French in origin, which makes sense because of the French influence on the Cajun people. But the French word for werewolf comes from loup, which is the word for wolf, and garou, which translates into the concept of a man becoming something animalistic. So loup-garou is the original word in French for werewolf, and Rougarou is what Cajuns and the descendants of the French Canadian settlers and the people who came directly from France, that's what they adopted to describe this beast. These stories have permeated the area for hundreds of years, and some people sought out the ability to shapeshift, others were cursed. It's just there's a lot of different stories and a lot of different backgrounds that create this story. Now, a couple of local experts talk of the legend and the folklore of the area. Now, it runs parallel with the heavy Catholic beliefs of this region as well. it becomes a boogeyman of types to keep children in line. In some ways, it's also used in a way, in one of the legends that's told about it. It even helps keep kids from telling secrets, because if you see a Rougarou, there's a specific number of days that you're not allowed to talk about it, or you receive the curse and it's passed on to you. It's also talked about in a similar way as kind of the Salem witch trials. You don't know if you are around a Rougarou. It could be a family member, or that tree over there, or the weirdo in town that has long hair. So it kind of smacks of that good old-fashioned otherism that we humans are so darn good at. But not all the time, though, is being a Rougarou a bad thing either. Sometimes a Rougarou will use its curse for fairly benign things. Sometimes it's a farmer who will turn himself into a cow to have a better looking livestock for trade. Sometimes it's a guy who gets a night job to help out a fisherman. It's a very charming concept beyond the potentially scary bad stuff. However, while the movie is not taking a stand on whether you should believe or not believe the stories people are telling you in this movie, these are very personal stories for these people. They are telling you firsthand accounts of something they experienced. They are telling you that something happened to them or someone very close to them. They are experiencing something. A couple people do wonder if what they saw was real. They don't know. They just know how they feel about it, and that it still affects them every time they tell the story or think about what it is that they saw. That's compelling. You can try to logic your way around the story or try to apply real world reasoning to what they think they saw, but let's be honest, nobody likes that guy. I consider myself a healthy skeptic, but I also like hearing the stories because, like one or two of the interviewees say, they saw something. They don't know what it was, but they saw something, and that's enough to make them uneasy. This all also takes place in an area where fiery emotions and deep superstition kind of rule people. You have Catholicism. You have the folklore from Europe and Native American societies. You even have voodoo. There's talk of the Haitian way that they deal with werewolves and Rougarou, and how that permeates into some of the stories because, well, some of that stuff is in the Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico is not that far away from the Caribbean. A lot of people, particularly Haitians, may go to Louisiana because of that French connection. All of these things kind of come with, curses or some sort of penance for sin. It's important to understand those parts of this documentary because it plays out in different ways. What a Rougarou is to one person may not be the same as what it is to another person. It could be a literal werewolf. It could be a wayward spirit. It could be a spirit that protects sacred ground. It could even be a different type of protector that looks after people or a space of land. There are so many different takes on the Rougarou, but they're all part of the same story. Depending on the background of the person who has a story is, one thing. Then the Rougarou will come from that background. If it's a different background, it matches that origin. The story itself is kind of like the Rougarou. It shifts in its shape and cultural significance based on the folklore matching the person who experienced it. But unlike the first two small town monster docs that I watched about the Missouri Monster and the Mothman, Skinwalker isn't necessarily as heavy in the folklore as it is with the first-hand story. However, I will say, though, that the folklore is definitely weaved in there very, very well. It's just that the things that stand out about this isn't necessarily the folklore like it was in those other two documentaries. It becomes a little bit more like the UFO documentary I reviewed a couple of months back. The folklore, which is always kind of my favorite parts of these movies, it's still there, like I said, but this time it's really kind of overshadowed. This is by far the most effectively scary film that I've seen to this point from Small Town Monsters. It uses a spectacular werewolf costume to give the viewer a little bit of a found footage style to support the stories being told by the witnesses. There are a couple of those scenes, not only with the werewolf itself, but also with these kind of wayward spirits that are always hitchhiking on the side of the road. They are legitimately scary and creepy, and it sticks with you. Again, like with the UFO documentary I did, I made the mistake of watching this a little too late one night, and I have to now figure out how to kind of shake some of those shots and scenes. But this still does balance the folklore, which brings back Lyle Blackburn, who does great work on a lot of these cryptozoology and legendary creature documentaries. And it balances that very well with the witnesses and the legitimately creepy footage used to dramatize those stories. I don't know right now. I mean, I got to maybe think on this a little bit more. I don't know if this is necessarily my favorite of the 5 Small Town Monster docs that I've seen, but I can definitely say that this was one that had legitimate frights, and I liked it a whole lot. Now, again, Skinwalker, The Howl of the Rougarou is available on DVD or Blu-ray from smalltownmonsters.com. On Tuesday, September 14th. You can also get it digitally from several outlets like Amazon Prime, Vimeo, Google, Apple, YouTube, and Xbox. If you want a little fright, and let's face it, we're rushing headlong into the right time of the year for that, but you also want it mixed with solid, well-studied folklore, this should do quite nicely for you. Now, that wraps up this episode of Film Seizure Streams the Movies. We're a little behind on the higher profile movies lately, but hang tight. We've got more movies coming out this year. We will likely get around to doing some reviews of and so forth. But until then, you can always catch new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday morning and a new Monster Mondays every Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. You can find all our stuff on sites like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, Stitcher, and Audible. You can also find our stuff on YouTube. Subscribe to us anywhere and everywhere that you like. You can also find Film Seizure on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, so you can stay up to date on everything that we release. So follow us there. Until then, don't go hunting in the woods, in the swamp. Don't go picking up hitchhikers wearing all white. And whatever you do, don't forget to save me the seat at the end of the couch.